Do like okay, everyone that's coming outside, you're going to hear the voice of Ashley. She's inviting you inside, back inside the lecture hall. And if you come in without your coffee, maybe even a song. So everyone, we're going to get started in 2 minutes. Everyone outside, text your friends to come back in. Tell them Ash is going to sing a song if they come back in.
I'm not going to. Is that a threat, Ash, or is that a promise?
Bit of a threat, because I don't have a good voice.
I need to stop talking. Like, sounds like I'm like listening to me. I'm going to hand it to you.
We'll give a couple more minutes. I think we dug into their coffee break, so they're going to want to.
Yeah, I know. I'm just trying to entice
I know it's good. I mean, people will stay.
Everyone else knows the secret in here. It'll be like an inside joke for everyone else that's already in, you know?
Do we have two people on? You on one side and then somebody else on the other?
Yeah,
I just want to know.
Yeah, there will be tests. I think just.
So I'm going to point. You're going to watch me pick people out of the audience.
Perfect.
Okay?
That's easier. Yeah. Then I don't have to pick one to choose. I love that idea.
Yep. So, sorry, where's the other? Who else is
Harley should be in here. If not, it will be Tess. I'll let you know before.
Okay, so you'll do one side of the room, and I'll try and make a balance because I think sometimes that side of the room doesn't get as much mic.
Okay. We tried that yesterday to do this and that, but there was less people at one point.
We'll figure it out.
Yeah,
we'll figure it out. I'm trying to do it in order of who has their hand up first. How's the Chateau Versailles?
It's good.
Sorry.
Good.
I actually moved rooms recently because they put me on the street one, which was a beautiful big room. And it was like, no, I don't need beautiful big room, noisy.
Okay, I want quiet.
I quite quiet little Japanese stuff. So yeah, it's very so easy to get here.
Yeah, convenient.
Because it must take you
20 minutes or so. Yeah.
You drive?
I scoot.
You scoot? Oh, cool.
Scoot or I bike.
Yeah.
Right now I'm scooting because I'm
Getting here ridiculous times.
exactly.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Well, I've got to say, Montreal isn't the best city for bike riding. Like it's not many lanes.
There are more and more and more, and there's a lot of bicycle advocacy.
Yes.
But our streets are terrible.
Yeah.
I mean, even this year, I've scooted for 8, 9 years now, and I've never been scared to be on my bike or on my scooter.
Right.
And I am just
Yes.
scooting now, feeling this is dangerous
Yeah, right.
because of potholes and water in potholes
Yeah.
that you can't see, and I feel precarious, and it's not just my aging; it really
No,
is the
no.
freaking infrastructure.
Yeah, it is. Or lack of.
Lack of, yeah, really.
So the woman came, she's like, it's so person, we're supposed to help people. She's like, I need a billionaire.
Need a billionaire.
Okay.
Okay, yeah, I'm going to sit down.
All right, I think we're going to start now. Welcome back. Our next talk, which is our next keynote, is called Co-Designing for Social Futures, Playful and Creative Cities for Older Adults. And I'm really so delighted to welcome Professor Larissa Hjorth here from RMIT University in Australia. So she's come a very long way, and she's hopefully over her jet lag a little bit. She's a distinguished professor, an artist, a digital ethnographer. Professor Larissa Hjorth has 2 decades of experience working in cross-cultural, interdisciplinary, collaborative, creative practice, and socially innovative digital media research. Professor Hjorth is currently the Design and Creative Practice ECP Platform Director. I don't know what that means, so hopefully we'll learn. Oh, the platform focuses on interdisciplinary collaborations and creative solutions to real-world problems. especially in relation to aging well, careful, and multisensorial methods. Professor Hjorth has worked with many industry partners. There was a question about where's the private sector. So many industry partners, including Intel, and has successfully been, I guess this is the primary investigator, on 5 Australian Research Council grants, as well as numerous arts funding and fellowships, including the Australian Council for the Arts New Media Fellowship, the Japan Foundation, Brian Korea Fellowship, Asia Link's Arts Residency, and the Australia Council Tokyo Studio. Some of her recent exhibitions include Model Citizen, which was curated by Redmond and Verhagen, the in the RMIT Gallery in February, The Art of Play at the Centre for Contemporary Photography in Melbourne, where she lives. She also co-curated Design and Play at the Design Hub with Lisa Byrne in 2016, which included artists and designers exploring play. So exploring play, I think, is one of the sub-themes of this conference as a way of bringing together people and coming up with creative solutions. So please help me in welcoming Professor Larissa Hjorth.
Thank you. Okay. Bonjour. That's the only bit of French you'll get from me. Sorry, I apologise. And I just wanted to give you, if nobody's seen these before, there's these wonderful badges out in the desk there, and they're fantastic. So get them before they go. I've already got one. So, and I also just want to warn you that after I talk, there will be a participatory component of this lecture. So I'm warning you so that you can think about it the whole time to prepare yourself. So we have 3 types of postcards. One is to write, draw stories. The other is to write, draw methods. And the other is to write, draw opportunities. And I'd like you to do this in collaboration with the person that you're sitting next to, or by yourself if you'd like, or with a group of 3. But we'll do this at the end. So I'm just preparing you. Okay. So I just want to get a sense of, with the crowd, working the crowd, how many people have played video games? Just put your hand up. Wow, okay, that's great. Who has a mobile phone? Right, okay. So, okay, that's cut a lot of the description part of my talk out. What about a smartphone? Right, wow, okay. Fantastic, well, there we go. I can finish my talk now. Okay, I want to thank the organisers of this fantastic conference. Sorry, am I buzzing a little bit? Kim and Shannon. Where's Shannon? There? Yep, over there. And I want to thank the fantastic Nora, Constance, and Ash.
Nora and Constance, I'm just here.
Oh, you're just here.
I'm just here.
You're just here doing jazz hands and
Nora
doing.
and Constance,
Right, okay. There's lots of people behind the scenes that have made this happen, so I just want to acknowledge their important work. So this morning we heard some really compelling talks in a panel around alternative forms of housing and invisible choreographies. What we could see is really those quotidian forms of activism and alternative forms of activism. And it was so exciting, so I feel quite, I have a lot of trepidation following such an exciting panel, hope I can be half as exciting as that one. Just to do a little bit of recap, yesterday we also heard some fantastic presentations that spanned from policy around the World Health Organization age-friendly cities interventions, from micro-activism to research creation. I'm getting my head around research creation because in Australia we call it creative practice after the UK model, and I'm like, no, we don't need to adopt the UK model. Let's adopt the Canadian model. It's better. So I've tried to rewrite it throughout my talk. As noted by May Chazen's excellent keynote yesterday on intergenerational storytelling, we need to innovate our techniques to challenge binary norms around ageing. Through her examples of digital storytelling for ageing activisms, we saw vividly how stories can help us to make sense of the world, which in turn shapes our future. And so in a sense, she did all the setting up from which I'm just going to build upon. So in this talk, I'm going to draw from different disciplines, and I'm going to explore intergenerational and cross-cultural storytelling through multisensorial techniques that combine ethnography, play, and research creation. Through some fieldwork examples from other countries, I hope to provide some ways to think about the nexus between the digital, the social, and the material in co-futuring ageing in the city. Rather than seeing technology as the solution, as is often the case when we hear about futures, I argue that we need to learn from the stories of everyday citizens' use of mundane technology, their quotidian creativity and micro-activisms as stories we can learn from to help co-future together. As we know, cities are complex spaces of contesting cartographies and uneven ways of being. Digital inclusion and exclusion is increasing. And I think in Australia, we are very similar to Canada in terms of having the differences, and the telecoms are all evil. And I'll get onto that later. Progressively, cities are being complicated by cartographies that entangle digital, social, material, environmental, human, and more than human. They are spaces in which inequalities are amplified. And I think this was really clearly identified in Aseli's talk this morning, where she talks about the micro-activist affordances. Jazz hands to you. This complexity requires us to innovate our methods for social change, to focus on the ethnographic, the playful, and creative techniques that allow and acknowledge the multiple forms of vulnerable agencies constituting our cities. So what do I mean by vulnerable agency? Vulnerable agency acknowledges the complexities of ways of being in the world across diverse ages, learning styles, and sensory experiences. Locating vulnerable agency at the centre of action research requires us taking care seriously as a series of methods, techniques, and implementation. Now, sorry, I'm just going to... So as Bold asks, as we imagine and create the cities of tomorrow, how can we include older people in the conversations we are having today? Bold is a great example of co-futuring by providing a series of based research workshops and activities that seek to bring together the community in diverse and inventive ways. As a term developed by UNESCO chair Soha Inatala, co-futuring invokes citizens, designers, and other stakeholders to come together proactively to contribute to what happens next. This approach seeks to empower through understanding lived experience to shape future settings. So in this talk, I will weave examples from ethnographic fieldwork and socially engaged art practice, or research creation, to reflect upon the ways in which we might curate conversations around ageing in the city as positive, as playful, multisensorial, and a creative activity. So, in a nutshell, I'm going to cover 3 areas. A little bit of an introduction to get a sense of how I got to this area. 2, I'm going to go to field work and tell you a story from the field. And 3, then I'm going to come back thinking about playful co-futuring. So the starting point for my research began in 2000 when I was living in Tokyo. At the time, NTT Docomo iMode, which was seen as the first mobile internet, was being rolled out. And we have Mark over there, who's just put a book out right now, which looks at tracing this whole genealogy. So there's Mark over there, Steinberg, so if you want to talk to him, he's the expert. The world was looking at Japan with a techno-orientalist lens. What was the future, what form was the future taking in terms of technology in Japan? Rather than partake in that problematic techno-determinist vision, I became curious about the social and cultural dimensions of technology, especially in terms of the extending the rituals and practices around co-presence and intimacy. I began to realize that mobile media was much more about a social and cultural practice than a technology. It was more about a continuity than a disruption. It needed to be put into context, into social and cultural practice. Let us meet Yoko, the owner of a Keitai mobile, and her plethora of Hello Kitties. Now, I can't even begin to go into the depth of what Hello Kitty means in its 30-year history and the gender traversing and things like that. But if you're interested, you can come and see me later and I can tell you all about it. But Yoko had this phone. And the first thing that I thought about this was like, you know, at that stage, phones were getting really small. You know how they go through trajectories? They get really, really small, and they get really, really, well, they start off really big, like on Wall Street, they're walking around like this. And then they go really, really small, and then they go really, really big, and then they go really, really small, like piano accordion with technology. So at this stage, they were really, really small. These were the little clam phones. And I thought, this is great because, you know, like, in terms of, I don't want to get into gender politics, but in terms of like women's bags, you know, putting it into the bag, you could actually find it. Whereas often I put my phone in the bag and I lose it for a long time. So I thought that's really great because, you know, it really helps to locate the mobile. But then I realized actually that locating the mobile had multiple dimensions, which were not only material and digital, but also cultural. So the material and digital cultures of mobile phones constantly evoke a sense of play, playful cartographies, place and place-making techniques. As Yoko and her story of collecting the 20-odd Hello Kitties unfolds, we learn how she connects places with people. It becomes like a symbolic kind of charm bracelet where everywhere she goes and she has a special moment, she gets a Hello Kitty to remember that moment. So it's always there, always ambiently there, following her around. It's like the weight of her memories in material form. This is a performative cartographic exercise in which presence and co-presence is constantly negotiated between the symbolic and the digital. The Hello Kitties become a story of intergenerational connection, for urban placemaking, for making sense of the world, and for feeling connected on many levels. What I found was when I asked people to talk to me about their mobile phone, I wasn't asking them about technology. I was asking them about the cultural practices of intimacy. Mobile media has always been about the entanglement between material and digital cultures. It is an embodied tool for placemaking that constantly grounds us. Place has always mattered to mobile media practice. However, now, in the age of a datafied city, in which things like geomedia or haptic touch screens dominate, placemaking and proprioception, that idea of the knowing body, takes on new agencies. So since interviewing Yoko a decade ago, where she was telling me about the different Hello Kitties, and there was Harajuku Hello Kitty and Shinjuku Hello Kitty, and she could tell this great long story about what she'd done on that day with her grandmother or her best friend, and it was like just this, Pandora's box opening up of these rich, rich stories which she carried around with her physically everywhere. So from there, I became motivated about how do mobile media practices help us make sense of the changing world, cultures, relationships, and environments. Understanding mobile everyday practices requires mapping the complex rhythms of how we live, die, celebrate, and grieve. For us as action researchers, this provides a proposition. How can we deploy ethnographic and research creation to not only develop deep understandings into practice and lived experience, but also embed our methods and knowledge exchange for social change? So mobile media practices can provide insight not only into the digital and visible, but also to the material and invisible stories. They operate upon symbolic and material dimensions as part of a making sense of place, intimacy, and the world more generally. For example, in ethnographic fieldwork into the Fukushima disaster known as 3/11, many people cradled their phones like they had their family inside, despite the fact that the mobiles weren't working due to a network failure. So for some people, they walked 10 kilometres cradling their phone in the hope that they could get contact with their loved ones. Here, the symbolic and material dimensions of mobile media in connecting intimacy with place can't be underestimated. The symbolic dimensions of mobile media for everyday life can also be seen as a crucial role for what is being talked about in psychology as the continuing bond for bereavement. Here we see the need to understand how intergenerational connections often aren't just with the living, but also with those that have departed but live on in our hearts and minds. In fieldwork with those experiencing loss and bereavement, the phone became not only a companion, but also a conduit for those continuing bonds. bereaved spoke of receiving and sending messages to their departed. These stories spoke of ways that people make sense of the world when they're grieving. They spoke of connection, belonging, and resilience. The symbolic dimension of the phone to connect to other worlds is significant. For example, the wind telephone here was made after the Fukushima disaster so that bereaved could go and make contact on the phone with their loved ones. Indeed, far from disrupting everyday practices, technologies can give us insight into the universal and local rituals and ways of being in the world. Here it is important to realise that the cities of the futures will be spaces for data of both the living and the dead. In response to fieldwork around mobile media and loss, we made a participatory work that sought to curate and change the conversations we are having about data, death, and life. We used the prompt, what does it mean when Facebook has more dead than living users? Through this postcard prompt, participants were asked to write on a postcard their hopes and fears for the future of data. These prompts were then curated through an Instagram account to further stimulate discussion beyond the exhibition. Japan is one of the few nations that have been deemed super-aged countries, and I don't think they're using super in a positive way, which gets back to the keynote yesterday talking about the binaries around aging. Super-aging countries are where they have more than 1 in 5 are over 65 years old. In Japan, they are grappling with burgeoning aging populations in which many will die alone. And so you've seen some interesting phenomena. Anthropologist Anne Allison is looking at the way in which, so in Japan, they have, you have graves and they're family graves and you get buried in there and you pay an annual fee. But if you have no other family, when you're dying, who's going to pay your annual fee? So they've set up these new graveyards, which are for people that don't have continuing family. And what's happening is that these people who are taking out these plots are actually meeting other people who are buying those plots because they want to get to know them in this lifetime, and they're actually moving across the country to live together before they die because they want to get to know each other in this lifetime for the next lifetime so that they can be friends already in the next lifetime. So this means that we have to think about a different way of that continuum between life and death. Again, globally, people are looking to Japan as the future where we can learn. And yet there's a lot of issues that can't be translated, which are very culturally specific, except one, which is the way in which future often gets conflated with technology. Like the future of mobile technologies 2 decades ago, it becomes clear in fieldwork that the role of technologies is to reinforce, but not to replace, the social. So from robots in aged care to priests, to the rise of priests doing ceremonies to release the ancestors from the material cultures such as the robot dog Aibo, technology again and again only works in unison with people. Here, the plethora of mobile apps that allow families to ambiently, without intrusion, keep a friendly eye on family members, particularly with dementia, are not replacing human care. Instead, they are an informal notion of what Jeanette Poles calls care at a distance. So Poles did her fieldwork in facilities using digital health and showed that technologies only worked when they were used in unison with people. So technologies cannot replace. And this is where we're looking in terms of the future of workforces. Of course, care is going to be a dominant one because robots don't know how to care. They don't know those slow rhythms. They don't know the textures. They don't know those complex ways of being in the world. However, her concept can be deployed to make sense of the multiple ways in which families use mobile technologies to have a form of care at a distance, an informal form of care at a distance. So like a kind of quotidian making do. And we've all heard those stories about, parents joining like Facebook and spying on their kids, and then the kids saying, I'm not on Facebook, that's for the parents, because now the parents are on there, it's like, so these, taking these ethnographic findings, we decided we needed to make a socially engaged artwork that activated a post-3/11 public in Japan. And so we worked with some activists in Japan that were working particularly around the rivers and uncovering the rivers and rediscovering the rivers, a lot of which have been replaced by new infrastructures like roads. So you can't actually physically see some of these underground streams. Social media like Instagram in a post-3/11 Japan had grown dramatically thanks to the deception of the big broadcast company NHK, who had deliberately withheld information about the Fukushima disaster. So it knew about it. The government contacted them and said, please don't let this out because we need to get a plan because this is going to set everyone in panic. And so NHK withheld. Can you imagine in the Western world anyway? Like in Australia, we have ABC, and if the government said, please withhold this story, they would get it out quicker, just to, just to spite the government. So it's a very particular context. But pretty much overnight, you had people, millions moving their trust from broadcast media to the kind of micro-narrative activism of social media. So as part of a 3-year project called Spatial Dialogues, we looked at artists who were complicating climate change. So once again, climate change tends to be politicized. So this particular grant, actually, when we had a very conservative government coming into Australia, the incoming Prime Minister had actually said, he'd looked at a list of all these grants and he picked on this one and said, this would never get up with my government. It has 2 things I don't believe in, climate change and art, so, which was like a badge of honor. Afterwards, everyone's giving me high fives in the corridor, all this kind of stuff. So, but it really was, like climate change gets politicized so much, and it's really, like ageism, it becomes these kind of binary normative narratives. It's like, it either exists or it doesn't. Now, I mean, the fact is the jury is in. It exists, right? But it's whether politicians can think about they can get the economic policies right and attuned to actually address that, because it costs a lot of money to undo all the bad things that we've done so far. But artists are really, through their kind of micro-activism, are really playing with the kind of these dominant narratives and really providing us some kind of alternative, that kind of grey space in between, which all of us actually live in. And so often these methods involve playing with invisible or forgotten cartographies of the city through digital, social and material means. So in one particular project, so that's one of the biggest intersections in the world, Shibuya, and this is the Boat People Association. They made, so that's a group of activists in Japan who do a lot of work. They're artists and urban planners who do works around streams and getting people to think about activism around the natural environment in cities. And so we put a big shipping container in a park in this area. And we located it there for 1 month, and we had a whole lot of artists doing different types of wayfaring exercises out of the shipping container to kind of think about the way in which we might rewrite the way that we do everyday ways of being. So during this time, we conducted multiple forms of wayfaring to get the public to think about the hidden water streams underneath this particular park. It was about connecting them to the invisible cartographies of the city. So I co-designed a mobile game with artists in which artworks were placed around the park, and you can see some examples here. And audiences who become players and participants had 10 minutes to find them in the park, document them and share them via Instagram. This was complicated by the fact that some people were mistaking artworks for rubbish and vice versa. And we kind of did this on purpose because we kind of wanted to mess things up, so that everyone was on the same kind of plane, so that the art connoisseur would come in and be a little bit confused too. So we were trying to kind of play with that, in terms of thinking about the kind of fine line between what is gameplay, where does the game end, where doesn't it? And a lot of the urban games do play with that kind of invisible boundaries. Where do we set that magic circle? So as I've argued elsewhere, mobile media is about embracing the paradoxes of everyday life, ones in which work and life, public and private, are constantly challenged. There is, as Melissa Gregg talks about, a constant presence bleed or a context bleed. Through ethnography, we can gain insight into those paradoxical rhythms of everyday practices, and through research creation, we can action these insights and understandings in new ways for social change. So now I want to turn to another cultural context. So we're saying goodbye to Japan, And we're going to go to Badalona in Spain to think about how care at a distance can happen in other informal ways. In this example, I want to reflect upon some of the paradoxes and opportunities for playful co-futuring of cities, for inclusive, vulnerable agency. So, start off with a question. How many people have played Pokémon Go? Hands up. Okay, not many. How many people have heard of Pokémon Go? Okay, all right. So you know it was a game that was on your mobile phone. You might have seen those players getting in little groups, and you kind of try and you have to walk on the road to get past them, and they're doing what is called a raid in Pokemon terms. Well, you would probably remember it 2 years ago, because it's like so 2 years ago, hashtag. You know, it's no longer new media, it's like mundane old media. But that's when media gets interesting, and that's where Wendy Chun talks about, like, that's because it's become part of our rhythms, and so that's when we can actually use it to talk about our everyday practices. So back in 2016, it was known as a perfect ludified storm, because it basically brought together decades of, you know, kind of pervasive games that were happening by, you know, alternative groups like Blast Theory, and it did it in a way that was really accessible. Downloads actually surpassed porn at one stage, so it really was a thing. I know, and that's like, you know, our tag for understanding, you know, impact. Anyway, but then it died and became mundane media. So I want to talk about Sophia, one of the people that we did an ethnography with. So 67-year-old widower nurse Sophia lives in the Catalan town of Badalona in Spain. After losing her husband to cancer a decade ago, Sophia initially found it hard to fight grief and depression. Her daughters and grandchildren have helped in this transition. In particular, Sophia is especially close to her 7-year-old son, Diego. They do many activities together, constantly sharing intergenerational skills. It was Diego that first introduced Sophia to the augmented reality game, Pokémon. As they wandered the streets of Badalona together, Diego would show her the digital overlays on Pokémon Go that reinvented Sophia's everyday experiences of mundane spaces. Pokémon Go allowed Sophia to uncover some of the multiple ways the familiar city could be reinvented. He taught Sophia how to flick. You know, there's that particular flicking of the ball where when you're on public transport, I was like, Pokemon Go player, Pokemon Go player, because you could just see by that haptic, and it's really interesting how it's teaching our knowing body to do different things with the screen. So he taught her how to flick the ball to capture those Pokemons. And so after initiation from Diego, Sophia opened her own Pokemon Go account. She would sometimes find herself briskly. She even bought new shoes and everything because she just started, you know, having to do so many kilometers to get those balls. She often found herself briskly walking the streets in search of Pokemon. Mundane trips to the market or shops became Pokemon Go adventures in which she could reinvent her routes and capture more balls. The city became a complex overlay with the digital, material, environmental, and social cartographies. Pokemon Go made Sophia feel fit and socially engaged in her community, and also an outstandingly super cool grandmother in terms of the eyes of Diego. The old media of Pokemon Go has enriched Sophia's life in many ways. It has reinvented the city in which she has lived for all her life. It has allowed her playful ways to enhance her relationships with her son Diego. It has afforded her new ways to connect with other generations. The haptic or touch sensibility of the game, which privileges proprioception or the knowing body, is more attuned to Sophia's fading eyesight. Through multisensorial haptic play, Pokemon Go has reinvented the city for Sophia. There is much to learn from the lived experiences of Sophia that requires us to recalibrate about how we think about play, multisensorial methods, haptic screens, and vulnerable agency in the city. Spain is a great example of how intergenerational play can recalibrate the city in terms of multisensorial cartographies for vulnerable agency. In discussion with Sophia, we were able to reflect upon the unevenness of the city and how games such as Pokemon Go highlight the paradoxes of the datafied city. And I believe here in Canada you have the same thing with black spots as we have in Australia. On the one hand, Pokémon Go encouraged physical exercise and social inclusion, which on that graph this morning was shown as the two things that will make us live to 100 or whatever, as part of its strategic gameplay. But on the other hand, the game engine drew on algorithms of the city in which has inherent biases, such as redlining, which is where different neighbourhoods have certain amounts of Pokespots depending on their demographic, the demographies. Play exposes the unevenness of bodies in the world, the ways in which cities inherit social, cultural, and economic bias as an embodied part of the quotidian mobilities. Sophia's story is not an exception. Rather, it is an increasingly common way in which old, mundane technologies are being playfully deployed for digital health solutions. In Badalona, which has been dubbed a Silver City for its innovative and integrated healthcare system centralised to the City Council, which is pretty amazing in itself, Pokémon Go is being recommended by social workers for clients to enhance two things: exercise and social inclusion. So they used to do a lot of what they call Scandinavian hiking, where you go out with a hiking, but that's not everyone's kind of game. And so they realized by giving different options like Pokémon Go, it allowed people like perhaps that didn't necessarily wanted to be near people but didn't want to have to talk to people. So Pokémon Go is great like that because you can just be parallel with people and you can be going, yeah, but you don't have to talk to them. So you're getting kind of all those great feelings of, kind of being next to them. And so, Badalona's council's healthcare has this kind of whole life focus in which its whole kind of system is centralised around citizens from when they are born to when they die. And so it's a really lovely integrated healthcare system, which we could learn a lot from. It is not by accident, and one of the things that was really interesting talking to the social workers was that they were looking at what everyday people were doing and trying to learn from that. So rather than bringing new things and having that kind of policy exerting things on practices, it was all practice-led. It is not by accident that haptic play games like Pokémon Go and Minecraft have had a high uptake by diverse intergenerational players. Its haptic play acknowledges multiple vulnerable agencies and non-normative ways of being in the world. Ethnographic exploration of lived experiences of plays in Badalona highlighted the need for learning from these mundane technologies that are embedded in everyday practices, rather than just having a silver bullet in the solution of yet another app. Instead, we can learn a lot from old media like Pokémon Go and how they can be reinvented to playfully traverse the city in creative and social ways that are inclusive for culturally, linguistically, and generationally diverse participants. And so now I want to look at the idea of civic urban play for inclusion. So there are many learnings to be taken from Badalona's civic engagement digital health strategy for ageing well, which is centred on lived experience. Neighbouring town to the south of Badalona is Barcelona, which also sees the value of play in terms of its deployment of urban play through their recent implementation of the superellas or superblocks, which have transformed the city into an intergenerational playground. So basically they have put on the grids of the town, they have put these playgrounds in the centre. Now, the city loves it. The citizens of the city love it because it's an excuse to hang out. So you can just go to this, what is a kind of crossroad and just hang out there, drink your coffee, talk with people and things like that. The taxi drivers, on the other hand, hate it because it's like now their whole city has been rerouted and everything is really hard for them. But for walking, for talking, for socialising, it's fantastic. Through urban planning intervention that puts play at the centre, infrastructures like roads become 1960s situationist international derives or drifting places for playful socialising. These SI techniques have provided constant inspiration, particularly through pervasive and urban games. Understanding the city through play is complex and productive. Play is an interdisciplinary concept, and if you get play researchers in the room together, they will all fight because they all think like sociology thinks they own it, psychology thinks they own it, they're all pulling at its legs, there's not much left of it. But basically, the way that I like to think about play, I don't even get the game scholars in there, okay, I can tell you what. But what I like about play is that it is creative and a form of expression, and it really is culturally specific. In an age of digital media, digital media has been characterized, its vernacular has been seen as playful. So you often hear terms like ludified. Oh, wow, okay. All right, going a bit quicker now. Okay, so critical cartographies. How many people know Strava? A few people. So Strava is one of these apps. It's a self-tracking app where people can, if they're running, they can go, oh, wow, and I've done a better time. And so it allows you to gamify against your own times. But what you've got is people taking those apps and doing things that weren't meant to be done with the apps, like, for example, drawing dogs in the environment and things like that. And so this is just a way in which, everyday people are kind of taking those apps and reinventing them just to kind of play with their own sensibilities. And then there was that big thing last year where, Strava with all its, heart was like trying to be really ethical. And it was like, let's release open source all our maps, our heat maps. And then what happened was that they exposed secret military bases. And in fact, it was this 22-year-old student in Canberra who found out, and like he put it on Twitter, and then he took it off because he thought, shit, I could be like, because those Trump governments are pretty like hard. So and then all his friends said, no, down Trump, come on, and so then he put it back on, and it was really interesting just watching. Everyone was like, oh no, and so it was a classic kind of example of how people can have the right, want to get it right but not get it right. So from a playful city in Ireland to Bristol's playable cities, cities have been reinvented through play as a method for social inclusion. This is Kate McLean's smell maps, where she's crowdsourced. This is New York, and it's actually been transformed by smell. So think about a city. Some people will actually not walk down particular roads because it smells funny and things like that. And things like smells are so subjective. They're so much part of people's backgrounds. So this is a very different way of how you navigate a city, which is invisible, but by exposing it, it can actually show some of the ways that we move through. Another form of crowdsourcing, kind of feelings or the kind of proprioception that is not often talked about is Jason Sweeney's Stereo Public, which is crowdsourcing the quiet. So how you can find parts of the city that are quiet to go to. Unfortunately, once it's been crowdsourced, then everyone goes to those quiet spots. So, it's constantly changing. Okay, so I'm just going to move because I've only got a couple of minutes, right? Okay, so in this section, I just wanted to talk about multisensorial methods and what we call creative practice, but what you call research, creation, co-design. So taking the understandings and insights from ethnography and implementing for social change, it requires inventive methods to curate public conversations differently. If we are to understand the city as multisensorial and intergenerational playground for vulnerable agency, we need to inspire people to co-design together for those social co-futures. Now, Canada, I feel like I'm preaching to the converted because, you've got all the best models here. So you've got scholars such as Pia Contas, who has been looking at the importance of research creation around dementia and aged care. We have public artworks like this one. How many people have played on this? Oh, great, yeah. So one of the great things about that is that it's using music and it's through collaborative play. Like you don't just swing there by yourself. You've got to have other people doing it. And so it creates an excuse for a kind of social interaction. Kim's work here, who I've been following for decades, has done some really important works around, problematizing technology, which is often conflated with young people, and actually thinking about what it means, in terms of the kind of everyday practices. We also have Concordia's Malou here, who are doing very important work around collaborations around play with the likes of Bart Simon. And we also have the work in anthropology, David Houts, who established the sensory studies field, which is, to think about how we make sense of the world through the senses. And so BOLD is kind of coalescing all this world-leading action research. So I want to return to the initial question. Oh, okay. I'm just going to zoom through this a little bit. Sorry, I've gone a little bit over time. So, yeah. So I want to return to that kind of question about how we curate the conversations around aging as positive, playful, and a creative activity. So to be bold about the city, I would suggest we need to reinvent how we map, move, and experience the city as multisensorial. So ethnography, as I suggested, can give us some insights into those kind of multisensorial techniques of the city and situated lived experience. Ethnography can help us to understand the ways in which the digital, material, and social all collaborate into a vernacular mode of policies care at a distance. It can help us to maintain a sense of co-presence and proximity when physical distance is an issue. Indeed, in planning smart cities of the future, we can learn a lot from the inventive quotidian practices. I'm just going to zoom along here. So I wanted to just kind of show you briefly some of the kind of work that we've just been doing around particularly culturally diverse groups working across with exhibitions and workshops and in classrooms and in community groups. And through a lot of this work, we've been, as we worked out when we were doing the ethnographic work, we started to film people's hands. And we became really interested in the story that people's hands were telling as opposed to the things that they were actually saying. And so often when people were talking through their reenactments with mobile phones, their hands will start doing gestures which may not correlate to what they actually do. So it's kind of creates this kind of different types of affordances, which really speaks to Arceli's work. I also wanted to just show you this particular work by a colleague of mine. So this was an exhibition plan design. This work on the right is by Jonathan Duckworth, where he made a haptic play table. And he worked with neuroscientists as a way to make the table for rehabilitation, as a rehabilitation device for stroke victims. So anyone that's worked in that space knows that one of the biggest problems is that because it's so boring, the tasks are so boring, people won't often do it. But if you can put playing there, it means people can be creative and expressive. And so it actually makes it fun, rehabilitation fun, which for clinicians is like, what? So these creative experiments sought to create alternative conversations around techniques of play for social inclusion. Another example was an exhibition where we brought Minecraft and Lego together, so thinking about digital and non-digital worlds, two different generations coming together. Often people will say when people haven't played Minecraft, they'll say, oh, it's like the digital Lego, And so what we did was, it was about trying to make participants become players that then become the artist. So people could move the works around, they photographed it on Instagram and hashtagged the art of play, put it on Instagram, and then their artworks, as you can see on the right-hand side, start to take up the wall. And then when the exhibition finishes, you have all the players and their artwork is, all their movements are the artworks. We also worked with schools for social play toolkits, which were about trying to take kids to think about, kids are really interesting in terms of thinking about that transition between physical play and digital play, and also what they do with their parents and how they play with their grandparents, etc. And so we started to try and unpack some of these things and make a kind of toolkit around it, so to think about how we might think about intergenerational play. And we also worked with a community centre, health centre, about trying to elicit different ways in which we might co-design with their clients and their staff to think about playful multisensorial methods. And so we often use things like drawing, we use things like Play-Doh, we made things like maps, which were multisensorial maps of safe and unsafe spaces, which you find that, when people are doing the kind of planning for the space, they often think about like staff and their lines of sight, but they won't necessarily think about the people the citizens who are using it and the ways for making it most usable. And then one of the other things we did was, and this is where I go into the dark, bad space of the telecommunication giants. So it's all very well to do this all this great work with, kind of participants around technologies. But the biggest problem is changing the technology companies. They will have the rhetoric of human-centered design, but it's a rhetoric that they use to just get their board members off their back. And a lot of their work doesn't actually draw on the power of lived experience. So I went to the evil giant in Australia, Telstra, and proposed to them to do a design challenge. And so we worked together around a design challenge called Aging and Digital Health. And the whole challenge was that it put teams together, interdisciplinary teams, and it put human-centered design at the centre. It meant that teams had to work with older adults. So you didn't just get, you know, young people all techie talking about older people. So it's really important to have in that kind of complexity in your teams. And it was really interesting because the kind of things that they invented weren't the shiny apps at all. What actually they were using everyday materials, like the role of the blind curtain when it opens and closes to let people know that you're okay. You know, things like that, just using materials that are already there to kind of be a part of the digital technology thing. And I think this is really important when, you know, we're thinking about, you know, we do need to do some educational pieces with the telecommunication companies about reinforcing all the time that technology is social. At the heart of it is social, yeah. And that they need to learn from the users. And if the history of mobile technology is anything to go by, users always reinvent the technology. Look at, for example, SMS was actually invented for the hearing impaired, and then the teenagers got it and they ran with it, and the rest is history. So I'm going to conclude now. So this is the maps around the safe and unsafe spaces that sometimes people don't want to articulate, but you know, it can be really useful by just putting it through drawing. So to return to the question about as we imagine the cities of tomorrow and how we can include older people in the conversations we are having today. So I've actually got a little exercise for you now. And so I would like to kind of to turn to you and ask you to talk about your experiences. And I've got these prompts, these postcard prompts, which are stories, methods, and opportunities. And you can draw or write on them. And so this exercise, what I'd like you to do is turn to the people next to you. And I want you to spend 5 minutes kind of introducing yourself and then say the first thing that comes to mind in terms of a prompt. And I want you to share that with your collaborator. And then once you've both shared, I want you to discuss what and how you would communicate it on the postcard. It could be just a little drawing, you know, it could be just a word. It doesn't, you know, there is no right and wrong for this. This is about an excuse just to kind of think we're, you know, almost we're over the halfway mark for the conference. We've had all these fantastic ideas and everything that we must be feeling stimulated to actually get some of this out. So this is a good excuse to kind of get that out. And if audience members feel comfortable, we would like to collect the responses. Now, if you don't feel comfortable, that's totally fine. You can take the postcards with you. But I thought for the ones that people that do find it okay, we could collect them and then we could record them. And then if people feel comfortable, we could record them on social media or something to share those experiences so that everybody starts to get a sense of the voices in the room. And that particularly for people that maybe haven't felt comfortable to ask questions or whatever, this allows them ways to kind of communicate those thoughts. So yeah, I hope you feel comfortable to do that on your postcards. Thank you. Play on. Thank you. So here comes the postcards, and you've got the pens. Yep.
Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. Okay. Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Yeah, right. Yeah, play on.
So thank you, everyone. We're running a little behind, of course.
Sorry.
So that's okay? Okay, so what you can do, tu peux l'écrire en français ou en anglais sur les cartes. Vous avez des options. Si tu veux écrire quelque chose que tu veux dire, tu peux l'écrire sur une des cartes postales en arrière. Et après, tu peux donner les cartes postales à nous ou tu peux les garder pour vous-même. So you can write, you can draw, or... Yeah, go ahead. So il y a des questions en arrière. Une question, what are your opportunities for inclusive co-futures? Do you have an idea for a method that can help develop awareness? C'est en arrière. Or tell us a story about you and an experience you've had where you felt perhaps vulnerable and you want something to change. Yes. But if you want to respond to any of those questions on any of the card, please hack the game.
Hack the game. That's what
Feel right on the back of it what you want. Yep, question here. Oui, j'ai entendu une question. Je vois une question. No. Agency, c'est vous. C'est votre pouvoir. It's you.
Yeah, yeah.
Yes?
Citizens. Yeah.
So, are there more postcards wanted or needed? Sure, go ahead. Yeah.
So some people, it seems that there's a lot of confusion. There's no right or wrong for this. So these are prompts, okay? So it's meant to just get you thinking and talking together. But the ways in which we've structured it is just to kind of give you 3 different options for prompts. And if you've got a card, say, about stories, and you don't want to talk about stories, but you want to talk about methods, that's fine. Or if you want to talk about opportunities, like, for example, in this morning's session, we were looking at alternative housing, and there were lots of fantastic, like Joyce's talk was all about, recreating what was there and thinking about how we might playfully kind of reinvent that. So that was an example of taking what we have there and thinking about new opportunities for the future. So there is no right or wrong. It really is about eliciting a kind of response and getting you to talk with your collaborate, like the people next to you, to talk about what is something that was meaningful for you that you would like to share. Yeah. Yes, okay. I'll give you, yeah. Yes, okay. So the way that vulnerable agency, so that was a term that I talked about, which was, it's basically trying to think about the complexity of ways of being in the world. So I gave the example of diverse ages or learning styles or sensory experiences. So, for example, we looked at those different maps. There was the quietness map. Now, if you are hearing impaired, a quietness map is going to have not so much relevance for you. So just thinking about those different unevenness, that kind of how our bodies come to the city in uneven ways. So it's trying to acknowledge that. Hopefully that makes, but its agency is not as in the government agency, no way. It's about people's agency. So just to clarify that, yeah.
I think let people do the exercise. What do you want to do?
Yeah, I'm happy with people doing the exercise, and then if they want to have questions, they can ask me. Come up and ask me.
Okay, can I just invite that?
Yes. Yeah.
Is that okay?
Yeah, is that okay?
And just remind people that the lunch.
Yeah.
Hi, everyone. This is Ash speaking. I'm sure you're all annoyed because every time I say something, I put a guideline. So we're just going to invite everyone to do this wonderful exercise that Larissa has invited us to do. And instead of just doing a regular question period, we're going to invite people, if you want to come to the front and ask Larissa those questions. And then just a kind reminder that we will have lunch. Lunch is not provided, but you are welcome to go to one of the restaurants that's close to us. If you have any questions, we're wearing an orange scarf, and we'll be reconvening at 2 p.m.
Thank you. So we're doing improv here.
Yes.
We thought we'd have way more time. Of course, we're always rushed. This is what happens. So if you do have a question for Larissa or for any of us, please just put up your hand, and while other people are doing the exercise, we can answer. The other thing to remind you is that we do have a choir happening in the 4th space at 12:30.
Sorry, I thought I had it like, I was like, it's 4,000 words. It's 40 minutes. I don't know how, I think I ad-libbed too much. I was like, oh, okay. I got lost.
It's always one of those dilemmas because I think the talk is so amazing and fascinating and people want to hear it. And so sometimes I'm not sure in those moments whether to leave space for conversation or to just let you go or whatever. So we didn't work that out in advance.
Yeah, sorry.
I should have done
Sorry.
that.
No,
I
my
should
bad.
have. I apologize.
No, because you did ask me, is it going to be on time? I'm like, yeah, it's on time. And then when you sat there and went 5 minutes, I was like, oh.
I should have, yeah. So sorry.
No, I ad-libbed too much.
I think it was a middle note. thought you were giving the cards. Anyway, I think this is a really
Yeah.
interesting invitation, actually.
Yeah, because I think, particularly like after the last session when that lady was saying about like wanting to connect with other people and things like that, this is just like one way.
Do you want us to collect the cards?
That would be, if people feel comfortable, but if they don't, then they can keep them.
Okay, I'll just leave it.
Yeah.
Hi everyone. If you like to keep your card, you're welcome to. But if you want to share it, please make it. Sorry, everyone just went silent and that got awkward. Feel free if you want to give your card back to us for Larissa. That is a great idea. If not, you can keep it for yourself and just the choir at 12:30.
Is it now? Yeah.
Okay, good. That was great.
Oh, thank you.
Oh my gosh. What an amazing talk.
Thank you.
I sat down and I forgot.
Oh, wow.
If you have
You're busy. Pardon?